This incident took place in central Indiana on the early morning of December 24, 2006. The following account is a direct recollection based on the notes I wrote down immediately after it happened. It was just before 3 o'clock in the morning and I was outside of my house on our back porch, which sits right above our basement door looking up at the sky. That night, the sky was overcast with low, even cloud cover, and there were no stars visible, no rain, and the temperature was in the 40s. We were having a pre-Christmas get-together, and while other people were drinking, I was completely sober because I happened to be on antibiotics at the time and was told not to mix them with alcohol. My two friends from college, Philip and Wesley, were also outside with me. Philip was smoking a cigarette under the porch near the basement sliding door, while Wesley had just gotten back from running out to his car to grab his wallet so he could settle a poker debt with one of our other friends inside. Without warning, what I can only describe as an intense pulse of energy streaked across the sky from the west to the east, moving from horizon to horizon in only about 2 seconds. This pulse carried with it an overwhelming electric and magnetic force unlike anything I've ever experienced. I was even near a lightning strike once when I was younger, which missed me by only yards, but this energy pulse was much different and felt even stronger in the air. The sensation coursed through my entire body, and it felt like some kind of electric wave that I could feel physically pushing against me. It almost made my body feel momentarily weightless, or like I was moving with the pulse as it passed overhead. It was a similar feeling to when you're floating in the ocean and a wave comes up and lightly lifts you up with it. I don't know if it was in my head or if it was from looking straight up at the sky, but I actually had to adjust my stance to keep my balance for a second. Also, as the pulse went over us, we heard a noise that was ascending then descending, starting as a low drone and rising to a high-pitched screech for a fraction of a second before dropping back down. The sound was incredibly weird too, and I don't think I could ever accurately describe it. At that same time, the overcast sky illuminated with a green and blue wave of light radiating across the clouds. Then, as the three of us were standing there staring at the sky in awe, a second, even brighter flash erupted across the sky, again filling the clouds with this incredible spectrum of light. This lasted only a fraction of a second, but was definitely more intense than the first one. This one didn't have any sound along with it like the first one did, though. Just seconds after that, we saw a complex network of tiny spidering lightning bolts, mostly blue and green, quickly flow through the clouds behind it. Almost instantly after that, our power cut out completely, along with a few streetlights and neighbors' porch lights we could see, only to come back on a few seconds later. For a moment, everything was eerily silent. I remember turning toward the house and looking at Wesley as he was walking toward me. Then the entire phenomenon repeated itself one more time. An identical pulse of energy blasted across the sky. The same bizarre sound echoed through the neighborhood, and it was all followed by another short power outage. This time, after already seeing it twice, we were all hyper-focused on the sky. It felt even more intense, but that could have just been our heightened awareness that amplified the experience. The three of us stood there in anticipation of another one, but that was the end of whatever was happening. In the aftermath of these three pulses, I could actually feel it in my body. My ears were ringing as if I'd been at a concert for hours. My eyes felt weird, which I'm guessing was from staring at the bright light 3 times in a row. And even though our power had come back on, the cable TV and internet were completely out and didn't come back on until later the next day. I'll admit that it could have been my adrenaline, but I felt like I was overloaded with electrical energy. My heart rate was high and stayed that way for hours, making it really hard to sleep. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, as if every nerve in my body was firing at once. These effects slowly went away, but I didn't feel completely normal again until the next day. Shortly after it happened, when we were all back in the house, I did something that I'm so glad I thought to do in the moment. I insisted that none of us talk about what happened until we had each written down separate detailed accounts, and everyone agreed to do it. Before I wrote my notes, I walked back outside to look up one more time and realized that what was once a completely overcast sky now had a long, narrow strip of clear sky running directly along the trajectory where the pulses had traveled. The clouds on either side looked totally normal, but it actually looked like some unseen force had parted them. When I came back into the house, I noticed that Philip looked a little sick and was acting like he was on the verge of a panic attack. He opted to go to bed rather than write anything down. Wesley and I, however, sat in the living room and wrote down everything we had seen, felt, and heard. Once we finished, we compared our notes and found them to be almost identical in every detail. It was exactly what I was hoping would happen because it was such an incredible thing to see that I wanted to be certain it was real. While I was writing my notes, I was actively trying to steady my breathing and lower my heart rate. In doing so, I experienced this strange euphoric sensation radiating from my spine and neck, almost like a deep muscle relaxation, but accompanied by an overwhelming sense of relief. It was as if waves of residual energy were leaving my body, causing extreme goosebumps and making my hair stand on end. This continued for over an hour. At some point, I leaned all the way back in my chair, almost unable to move, simply absorbing this feeling. That weird but nice feeling changed by morning though. When I woke up, I had an intense, piercing headache that felt like it was located just behind my right ear. It didn't last that long, maybe an hour or so, but it was sharp enough to jolt me upright as soon as I opened my eyes. As I was up and getting ready, I noticed something else strange. When I was getting in the shower, I noticed my face and hands looked sunburned and were mildly painful to the touch. I do remember my doctor telling me that the medication could make me more sensitive to UV and direct sunlight, but I really hadn't been in any bright sun, and it was the middle of winter, so it's not like I wouldn't have been covered in long pants and a coat. The last strange symptom was nausea. I ate breakfast after my shower, but I was unable to keep it down and I threw up just minutes after I'd finished eating. Again, I know this could be related to my antibiotics, but I really don't think that's the case. I've taken several different kinds of antibiotics in my life, and I've never once had any problems with them. The whole thing was, without a doubt, the strangest and most inexplicable experience of my life. We never heard a word about what we saw on the news, or from neighbors, or from anywhere else. I know the first thing most people think when I tell the story, and it's that it was a crazy electrical storm with ball lightning or waves of lightning in upper clouds, but my gut just tells me that is wrong. I've lived in the Midwest my entire life, and I feel like I've seen every type of thunderstorm in existence, but what we saw was so wildly different. I won't rule anything out, and I'm just as skeptical as anyone when it comes to things like this, but I can promise, anyone who would have seen this in person would feel exactly like I do and wonder what in the world it could have possibly been. I used to be a FedEx driver in a somewhat rural part of Washington state, and one day I experienced something that was so strange I actually quit my job afterward. It was a completely normal day at work, and I was on a road I've been on a million times. I remember it being a really nice day in May, and the part of the road I was on was kind of in between communities where there wasn't much around except for large farm properties and a handful of fields of wine grapes growing. I distinctly remember my favorite classic rock mix playing on my little Bluetooth speaker, and I was thinking about which one of two roads I wanted to use to get to my next stop. The next part of the story is a little weird because I'm not sure if it's related to what happened to me or not. While I was driving down this specific section of road, I started to hear something outside. My first thought was that my truck was having an issue because it sounded like metal clunking and screeching at the same time. Thinking about it after the fact, the sound reminded me of moving a large, heavy metal table across a concrete floor in small, short movements, like if you were pulling it a few inches at a time and it made a loud clunk and screech each time. Anyway, like I said, I thought something was wrong with the truck. As a driver, you're not really supposed to open the doors or windows while driving, so I ended up pulling over for a second to open my door and see if I could hear where the noise was coming from, but as soon as I did, it was completely obvious that it wasn't coming from the truck. To my ears, and this is going to sound strange, it sounded like it was coming from up above me in the sky. I guess it could have been coming from anywhere and echoing to make it sound like that, but it really did sound like it was coming from directly above me and out of nowhere. At the time, I figured it was most likely some kind of farm equipment nearby that just sounded like that to me for whatever reason, but was coming from one of the nearby fields. Not really thinking much of it, I shut the door and started driving again, still hearing that noise every few seconds. The very next thing I remember was waking up. I'm saying I woke up, but that's not totally accurate. I was still driving the truck and on the same road, but I was about a mile farther down the road than I had been just seconds ago, and I felt like I had just woken up with zero memory of getting to that part of the road. The second thing I noticed is that my music wasn't playing anymore. I grabbed my phone and it was completely turned off. Not like when the screen is just off, it was actually off, like I'd gone in and shut it down. My Bluetooth speaker was also turned off, which made no sense to me. I started to feel really weird and pulled the truck over again. I sat there for a second and was taking sips of a Gatorade I had with me when I realized I had no idea where I was or even who I was for at least a couple of minutes. I remember looking around the cab of the truck being completely unfamiliar with it, as if I had never seen it before. I was looking into the back of the truck and seeing boxes and packages, then down at myself and seeing the FedEx logo on my uniform, and even saying the word FedEx out loud. It was a little scary and extremely disorienting. The best way I can describe how it felt to me is that it reminded me a lot of that old show Quantum Leap, where the main character would just get dropped into someone else's body suddenly. Then he would have to take a few minutes to realize where he was, who he was, and what was going on. That's what it felt like to me. I was just sitting there in the truck letting it all come back to me, and the more I remembered, the more I started to worry about what had actually happened. As anyone would, I immediately thought something had to be wrong with me medically, and I started asking myself if I'd just had a mini stroke or some minor heart attack, but I physically felt fine. Other than not remembering the past 5 minutes of driving, I didn't have any other symptoms, pain, or sensations of any kind. It really messed with my head though. After sitting there for maybe 10 minutes, I decided to call in and let them know what had happened. It might not have been the best idea, but I ended up driving the truck back. I did leave work as soon as I got the truck back, then went into the hospital to get checked out. I had several tests done over the next 2 days, from blood work to imaging, and from what they could see, there was literally not a single thing wrong with me. I'm still pretty young, I've never smoked or drank, and I've always tried to stay active and healthy, so every test result came back perfectly normal. The only answer I got from the doctor was that I could have gotten dehydrated and partially lost consciousness, luckily pulling over in time. I guess that's possible, but it seems very unlikely to me because I'd been drinking normally all day and I didn't feel dehydrated at any point. I also didn't have even a second of time where I felt lightheaded or that I might pass out. That whole day left me with a weird feeling and a decent amount of fear, and I ended up quitting my job shortly after getting all of my medical stuff done. I wasn't really afraid of driving for work after that, but I had acquired this new and pretty intense anxiety of driving alone, especially in rural areas. It's hard to explain, but it made me not want to do that job anymore. I also think back to that noise I heard before it happened and how I've never heard anything quite like it. I suppose all of it combined gave me a bit of PTSD. I'm not saying I think I was abducted by aliens or had some kind of paranormal experience, but something really weird did happen to me that day, and the loss of time and memory shook me up pretty badly. The fact that I had so many tests done and can safely say it wasn't a medical issue makes it even worse. In my opinion, the noise and the lost time are connected somehow. I just don't know how. It's changed me deeply, and I still go out of my way to avoid driving on rural roads, especially if I'm alone, and I still get a small feeling of panic if I hear someone scoot a chair back at a restaurant or hear metal scraping of any kind. It probably sounds stupid, but I have this gut feeling that something more happened to me that day. 2 years ago, I was hiking near Lake Tahoe with some of my family when we encountered something that none of us have been able to explain. This isn't your typical sighting or lights in the sky, but it still freaked all of us out. It was in the middle of summer, and the mosquitoes were definitely out because we could hear them in the air the entire time. We had started out in the late morning, setting out on the Mount Tallac Trail, and planned to do a long but casual out-and-back mix of jogging and hiking. The day was warm, but not unbearably so, and aside from a few other hikers, we had most of the trail to ourselves. By late afternoon, we were making our way back down the trail right as the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. As anyone who has hiked this area during the summer knows, dusk brings out the mosquitoes in full force. We had bug spray, but by the time we reached a more open section of the trail where there's a meadow off to the right, they were swarming around us so aggressively that we all picked up our pace just trying to keep moving. As we were getting close to the trailhead, maybe 5 minutes from where our car was parked, something caught my cousin's eye just off the trail. At first, I didn't understand what she was looking at, but then I saw it too. There were 5 perfect circular divots or holes in the ground, each about a foot in diameter and several inches deep. They were arranged in an eerily precise semicircle, all pointing away from the trail and toward the meadow. The thing that struck me immediately was how clean the holes were. It wasn't like something had been dug up and left in a messy pile nearby. Whatever had made these depressions had removed the dirt and grass completely, as if it had been scooped away with a giant cookie cutter. I knew for certain that these holes hadn't been there when we hiked up this same section of trail earlier in the day. They were so noticeable and perfectly arranged that they would have been impossible to miss, not to mention they were only feet off the trail. As we stood there staring at them, it took a moment for us to register something even more bizarre. The mosquitoes were gone. Moments before, we had been swatting at them, trying to keep them out of our ears and faces, but now there were literally none. The entire area around the holes was silent, just still air, and it was really unsettling. My cousin, who was the one that first noticed them, walked right up to one and bent down to inspect it more closely. She reached out and pressed her hand into the ground between 2 of the holes, then quickly pulled her hand back and said it was hot. She started to feel around and said the entire area felt hot. At first I thought she was exaggerating, but when I walked in closer to put my hand near the ground, I could feel it too. It wasn't just residual warmth from the sun, which had already set behind the mountains. It was a localized heat, concentrated around the holes and definitely coming from the ground. It made me really curious, and I carefully put my foot inside one of the holes. The dirt at the bottom was noticeably hotter than the surrounding ground, and I could absolutely feel the heat coming through my shoe. It felt like when you have your foot too close to a campfire or something. I remember us all looking at each other, and I could tell everyone was thinking the same thing. What caused this? We started talking about it, but we were all completely dumbfounded. Up close, the precision of the holes was even more impressive. That, along with the heat coming from them, the sudden absence of mosquitoes, and the daylight going away made us all feel really uncomfortable. There were no signs of animals or footprints anywhere in sight, and no disturbance in the surrounding grasses or dirt either. The whole scene honestly looked like something had landed there, then took off. At that point, it was starting to actually get dark, and none of us had a flashlight or headlamp with us, so we got back on the trail and headed to the car. As soon as we started running again and moved away from these holes, the mosquitoes returned in full force. It was like there was some invisible barrier back into the normal world. It was really weird. We spent the drive back talking about underground gas vents and volcanic activity that might have caused the ground to heat up like that, but that wouldn't explain the perfect holes. My cousin mentioned park rangers working there or even some kind of study going on, but that didn't add up either. My uncle, who has spent a ton of his life outdoors, said that he had never seen anything like it before anywhere. A year later, a group of us hiked the same trail and returned to that same spot out of curiosity. To our surprise, the imprints of the holes were still faintly visible, as if whatever had created them had left a lasting mark on the land. One thing we noticed that was even more unsettling was that a significant portion of the meadow surrounding the semicircle was now dead. The grasses were all dry and brittle in a larger circle around the area, and the dirt underneath looked cracked and dry. The rest of the meadow was still lush and green, but that particular spot looked like all the life had been drained from it. After our hike that day, my uncle drove down and talked to a park ranger at one of the campgrounds. He described the holes in the dried up meadow to him and how we'd been there and seen it a year earlier when the ground was hot. The ranger said it could have something to do with past wildfires or climate change, but he really had no idea. He did tell my uncle that he was sure there wasn't any kind of work or study happening on that trail, but mentioned it could be as simple as some random person going up there with a shovel and digging where they shouldn't be. We had already thought of that, of course, but these holes were too perfect, and there's no way digging a few holes in a meadow would make the ground actually hot to the touch and block out all the mosquitoes. Nothing really added up. Every summer when we get together, we inevitably end up talking about it again, and we try to come up with new ideas about what could have caused it. I don't want to sound like some conspiracy theorist, but when I think back to that first hike, I can't help but feel like something had landed there. To me, that's just what it looked like. I haven't been back to that trail since last year, but as far as I know, the imprints are still there. I know a lot of people hike that trail every year, so maybe someone else has seen them too. I'm hoping to get back up there again soon, and I'd really like to check it out again now that another year has passed.